Moed Katan Daf Beis. We begin with an introduction to the Masechta. The topic of Moed Katan is primarily that of Chol HaMoed, the halachas of the intermediate days of Yom Tov between the first days and the last days on Sukkot and Pesach, where you have a partial Isser Malacha. It's forbidden to do some work, but it's permitted to do other forms of work. The Masechta will also spend a parak talking about the rules of Avelis, rules of mourning. So to introduce the halachas of Chol HaMoed, Rashi explains that there are conflicting implications in a pasuk describing Pesach. It links intermediate days to the seventh day, and it also separates it from the seventh day to show that there are some Yisurim Malacha and not others. Rashi says that the Torah left it up to the Chachamim to decide which categories of work will be permitted and which will be forbidden. So the Chachamim gave us, according to Rashi, 5 types of work that are permitted, 5 principles which would make work permitted, and 4 restricting principles which would minimize those 5 principles. Our mission will talk about the first 2 of those principles of permitted categories of work. It'll speak about work which is to stave off a loss, to prevent a loss. That's what we call a davar ha'avud. It'll also talk about work which is required to address the needs of the public, tzarchei rabim. Now, the Mishnah will also bring in one of the limiting factors, which is you cannot work too hard. Even if you're doing something which is davar ha'avud, to prevent a loss, or tzarchei rabim, you cannot work too hard along the way. It has to be limited to a certain level of tircha, not too much tircha. So the Mishnah begins by discussing 3 types of scenarios. It'll discuss again the first 2 halachos. So as far as preventing a loss, it talks about watering a field. It'll speak about when you're allowed to water the field and when it's considered to be too much work. It'll also talk about other work you're allowed to do for the field. Then it'll introduce the topic of tzarchei rabim and different types of tzarchei rabim you're allowed to do. The Gemara will have 2 linguistic problems on the Mishnah. The Gemara will try to clear those up. Then the Gemara will want to know who the author of the Mishnah is based on another brisa. The Gemara will settle on one. And then the Gemara will introduce a totally unrelated topic, which will cycle us back around to the halachas of our Mishnah, and that's the question of when you weed your field on Shabbos, what malacha are you violating? So let's begin. The Mishnah begins again discussing when you're allowed to irrigate, when you're allowed to water your field. So there are 2 types of fields, and there are 3 types of irrigation. 2 main types, 2 subtypes. So fields come in 2 forms. There are fields which are naturally watered by rain, and fields which are naturally watered by irrigation. Fields which do not have rainwater collecting on them. Rashi says those fields are usually on the slope of a mountain, and the rainwater runs off and it doesn't get absorbed into the ground. So, if the field is watered by the rain, so the Mishnah doesn't say anything about it, and its implication is that it's always forbidden to water those fields under any circumstances. The Gemara will explain that's because you don't need water there to prevent a loss. Any water that you add there might be just to increase the value and the quality of your product. That's not allowed on a Chol HaMoed. The only thing that's allowed is to prevent a loss. So we're talking about only fields which depend on irrigation. So what types of irrigation could you bring? So the Gemara says you could bring either a spring, or you could bring water, meaning you could direct a spring to flow into your field, or you can bring water by a pail from a well or a collecting standing pool of water. So as far as directing a spring to go there, it depends what type of spring. If it's a new spring, then the walls of the spring aren't hardened, they may collapse, and therefore you may come to fix them. Our Mishnah says that's not a problem. Any type of spring, even a new spring or even an old spring, whether it's a newly formed spring and there's concern that the walls may break and you may be tempted to fix it, or an old spring where you don't have that concern, either of those you're allowed to direct towards your field that depends on irrigation. Now, other types of watering, such as bringing it from a pool or from a well by pail, that's forbidden because that is too much work. Now, our Mishnah says that all these halachas apply not only to Chol HaMoed, but they also apply to Shemitah. Shemitah is also forbidden to work your land, just like it's forbidden on Chol HaMoed. But you're also allowed to prevent loss. The Gemara will explain later why. And therefore, these halachas which we said are permitted on Shemitah are also permitted on Shvius. You're allowed to water a field that depends on irrigation with spring, whether it's new or it's old. Now the Gemara discusses other forms of tircha, such as making a channel digging out a channel to direct water to your spring. Up until now we were talking about diverting the spring without having to dig a channel. Here the Gemara is saying to dig a channel. So here the Gemara says it's a machlokas. The opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is that it's forbidden to dig a channel on Chol Hamoed or on Shemitah. The Chachamim say you are allowed to make a new channel on Shemitah, but not on Chol Hamoed. To fix an old channel, you're allowed to do even on Chol Hamoed. You're allowed to do that whether it's Chol Hamoed or on Shemitah. All right, now the Gemara moves on to the Mishnah moves on to the heter to do work on Chol Hamoed because of tzorchei rabim. So it says you're allowed to fix the channels that bring water to the people. You're allowed to clean them out. You're allowed to fix the bricks that fell off them. You're allowed to fix the roads, the streets, the mikvos of water, the reservoirs of water, and any type of tzorchei rabim you're allowed to do. You're allowed to mark graves so that Kohanim don't walk on them, and you're allowed to send messengers out into the fields to check that there's no kilayim, there's no forbidden mixtures of vegetation and trees growing together. You're allowed to do that also. That was one of Beis Din's practices. Okay, that concludes the Mishnah. The Gemara begins with two linguistical questions. First of all, the Gemara wants to know, why do you have to tell me that irrigating a field, and again we're referring to a field that requires irrigation, that it's permitted with a new spring and an old spring? Tell me you're allowed to use a new spring, and I can figure out you're allowed to do an old spring. Obviously, an old spring, there's no concern that the walls will collapse, so certainly it should be easier to do than a new spring. So the Gemara answers because we're trying to teach you both halachas. We're trying to teach you that a irrigated field you're allowed to irrigate, and a field that receives enough rainwater you're not allowed to irrigate. And we want to tell you both are true for either type of spring. So we need to say, if you have a field which is naturally not irrigated, it requires irrigation, you're allowed to use even a new spring. But that's only for this field. A field that has natural rainwater you're not allowed to irrigate, and that's even in old spring. Even to direct an old spring there you're not allowed to do. So therefore we have to state both halachas to show that it's only an irrigation field and not a field which receives enough rainwater. Alright, now the phraseology used in the Mishnah for a field which is naturally irrigated only is called a beis hashlachin. The Gemara says the word shlachin, where does that come from? The word shlachin means thirsty. And if you look in the Targum, the Gemara says, of the phrase Va'ata oyef v'yageya, and you were faint and tired, we translate the word oyef as shalhi. Shalhi, the hay can be replaced with a ches, and therefore it's shalchi. That's the translation of the word oyef, which means faint. So shalchi means faint, it can be faint from thirst, and therefore beis hashlachin is a thirsty field. Now, a field which receives rainwater is called beis habal. Gemara says, what's the translation of Baal? Baal means it's settled, it has enough, it's comfortable in its residence, it has enough. Where do you see that? The Gemara says, if you look at the translation of the pasuk in Yeshaya, Ki yival bachar basula, when a young man will be together with a young woman, so the word yival is translated as mitosov. Im besulta yisyasvun. Okay? So you see that mitosa, which means to settle, is the translation of the word yival. So baal means to settle, and therefore a field which receives enough rainwater is a settled field. Alright, now the Gemara wants to know who the author of our Mishnah is. Now there are three halachos that we need to find that one person holds in order for this Tana to be able to qualify as the author of the Mishnah. That is, you are allowed to do work on Chol Hamoed in order to prevent loss. That's why you're allowed to direct to a irrigated field. Second halach is you're not allowed to do work in order to cause an extra profit, to create a gain. That's why you're not allowed to direct water to a field which has rainwater. And the third halacha is that it's forbidden if it's too much work, and that's why you're not allowed to bring water by pail. So where do you see all these three halachos in one individual? So the Gemara draws two approaches. The first one, the Gemara wants to say, is that it's Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, because Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says you're allowed to conduct water from one tree to another tree as long as you don't water the field along the way. That's if you have a lot of water around one tree and you don't have enough water around another tree, so you can dig a channel from one tree to the next tree and then you can move the water there. Now as far as the water around the tree, the Mishnah also said one other halacha which should have been mentioned earlier, which was that you are not allowed to dig a channel around the tree, a trench circling the tree in order to keep the water there. But here, anyway, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says you're allowed to channel the water from one tree to the next as long as you don't water the field along the way. So there you see the halacha that you are allowed to move the water. You're allowed to help the field in order to prevent loss from the tree of being dried out. And it also says that you're not allowed to make sure you are not allowed to water the rest of the field on the way because that would be extra. So you see 2 of the 3 halachas. In most cases, you don't see the 3rd halacha. You don't see that if there will be extra tircha, if it's too much work, that it's forbidden. So says the Gemara, therefore we'll go on to another approach, and that is Rabbi Yehuda. And in order to show us this, the Gemara introduces a 3-way machlokes in a brisa between Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Machlokes is, in this brisa, is discussing what type of field are you allowed to water with a new spring. That's a spring that was never used before. There is concern that the walls will collapse and you may be tempted to fix them. So what type of spring, what type of field are you allowed to water with that? Rabbi Meir says any type of spring, whether it's any type of field that is. Again, the question is what type of field are you allowed to irrigate with a new spring? Rabbi Meir says any type of field, whether it's an irrigated field or a field that depends on rainwater, both are permitted. That obviously doesn't fit with our Mishnah because our Mishnah clearly holds that it's only a field which depends on irrigation that you're allowed to direct the spring to. Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to only send it to a field that depends on a spring, but the spring has dried. The Gemara explains it can't be that the field is dried because then there will be no point in irrigating it. It'd be useless. But it's talking about a field which lost its spring, so you're going to bring a new spring there. The Gemara is going to say that's our Tana. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says you're not allowed to use a new spring, not for a field that's irrigated or not for a field that depends on rainwater. Both are forbidden. He's concerned that the walls will collapse. Now, the brisa ends off. Rabbi Yehuda adds, you're not allowed to direct water from a spring to your garden or to your churva on a chol hamoed. So now, says the Gemara, you see from this brisa, Rabbi Yehuda is our man, because he says that you are allowed to water a field which depends on irrigation, so you see you're allowed to prevent loss. You're not allowed to water a field which has enough rain, so you see that you're not allowed to just increase profit, and you're not allowed to do anything that's too much work, that's why you can't send it to your gina or to your churva. So the Gemara asks, hold on a second, but this is only talking about a spring that's new. How do you know that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the same applies for a spring that's old? The Tana of our Mishnah said whether it's new or it's old. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda holds a spring that's old, you're allowed to do whatever you want. So Gemara says, well, if you're going to say that, then you won't have anybody that fits in our Mishnah. It can't be Rabbi Meir, as we said, and can't be Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because he says that it's forbidden either way. So it'll have to be Rabbi Yehuda, and we'll have to assume that he says like we said in our Mishnah. And the reason why this Mishnah only talks about a new spring is because it wants to teach you, even in Rabbi Meir, it was Rabbi Meir who went first, and even a new spring, Rabbi Meir says, is permitted to water both a field that depends on rainwater and a field that depends on irrigation. Okay, now the Gemara goes on to a different subject, which will take us back to the halachas of our Mishnah, specifically that of watering a field on Shemitah, which our Mishnah said is permitted. So this discussion is, when a person weeds or waters a field on Shabbos, what malacha is he violating? We need to know, because we have to warn him. In order for him to be able to get the proper onesh, he has to be warned. So what should we warn him for? We have to mention the specific malacha that he's violating. So it's a malacha between Rabbah and Rav Yosef. Rabbah says it's violating the malacha of plowing. The definition of plowing is softening and preparing the earth to better serve the plants that will grow in it. Weeding and watering is giving the earth the power to support the plants that you want it to grow. It's removing things which drain its nutrients and is giving it more. Now, Rav Yosef says no, it's planting, because plowing means you're preparing the earth. What you're doing here is you're actually helping increase the produce. You're increasing the growth of the fruits. That's planting. Planting creates fruits. You're creating fruits. So that's the machokas. Says Abaye, I don't understand either of you. Both of you seem to be correct, and therefore you should both say both. Why do you only say one? Maybe you'll tell me because it can only be one malacha. That's not true. You can have two malachas at the same time. For example, if somebody prunes a tree and he also happens to want firewood, so he's doing both, helping the tree grow better by removing some of the branches and getting him wood for his fire, then he violates two malachas. He violates the malacha of harvesting and he violates the malacha of planting. So why don't you say that both are true? Weeding and watering violate both choresh and zoreah, both plowing and planting. Says what's a kasha. Okay. Fine, you asked, good. Now the Gemara moves on to try to bring a proof on the subject. So the Gemara says that Rav Yosef has the kasha to Rabbah. In halachos of kilayim, we know you're not allowed to have vegetables and grapes growing in the same patch of land. So there it says that somebody who weeds the land or somebody who covers the seeds violates the Isser of kilayim, and he gets malchus for it. And Rabbi Kiva says, even if he just is mekayim, meaning he keeps the plants there, he has to do some action, and not just that he doesn't take action against it, he has to do some action to increase the existence of the plants there. He builds a fence around it, or he does something to support the growth. So now, the Gemara says as follows. Here we're talking about menachesh, right? We mentioned weeding. Now, on kilayim, there is an issur to plant kilayim. So the issur of zoreya applies. There is no issur to plow for kilayim. At the time of plowing, you're not planting. There is no kilayim involved. So there's no issur of plowing. So according to me, that the issur of menachesh for Shabbos, the issur of weeding for Shabbos, is planting. So I understand. Here it's also planting, and planting is forbidden when you have kilayim. Kilayim planting is usher. But according to you that it's plowing, so there is no issur of plowing, why should weeding be forbidden? So Gemara answers, it's not forbidden because of planting, it's forbidden under the category of keeping it, of continuing the growth. Gemara says that can't be, because that's what Rabbi Kiva said. Rabbi Kiva said keeping it is usher. We're talking about the Tanakama. They're obviously disagreeing. The Tanakama must not hold it keeping it is usher. Gemara says no, it's all Rabbi Kiva. The Tanakama is Rabbi Kiva, and he's explaining himself. He's saying it's for that if you weed it, you're violating an Isser. What Isser? Keeping it. Because Rabbi Kiva says it's Isser to keep or to do anything to protect and keep kilayim growing in your field. Okay. Now, the Gemara says, what is the source of Rabbi Kiva's halacha? Where does he know that there's an Isser to keep or to do anything to keep and maintain kilayim in the field? So the Gemara says, it comes from the pasuk describing kilayim. The pasuk says, it says your field you should not plant kilayim. That's a weird syntax. Why does it say your field you should not plant kilayim? It should say don't plant kilayim in your field. Says the Gemara, because we wanted to have an expression using the word kilayim that came before it, where we said sarbia kilayim sadcha le'sizra. You want to be able to have a phrase kilayim sadcha le, which is you have to have the mitzvah of kilayim in your field? No. If there is kilayim there, you have to get rid of it. The fact that you don't get rid of it and you even do something to protect it, that violates the isser of kilayim b'sad chalai. That's Rabbi Kiva's source, that it's also to even keep kilayim growing there. Alright, now the Gemara's question is that, let's go back to the halacha of Shemitah, which we mentioned in our Mishnah. In the Mishnah we had said that on Shemitah, you're allowed to water the field. The Gemara says, why should that be? Watering the field, we said, counts either as planting, according to Yosef, or as plowing, according to Rabbah. Well, guess what? Both planting and plowing are forbidden during Shemitah. So you shouldn't be allowed to do watering, according to either opinion. Why does the Mishnah say you're allowed to do it during Shemitah? Someone offers two approaches. Abaye says the reason is because we're only talking about Shemitah in our days when there's no Beis HaMikdash, and Shemitah in our days is only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan allowed certain leniencies, just like they were allowed to allow certain things in Chol HaMoed, they were also allowed to allow certain things for Shemitah d'Rabbanan. Now, how do you know that Shemitah is only d'Rabbanan in our days? So Abaye brings a source. He says the pasuk describing Shemitah uses the word Shemot twice. It says, V'zer dvar Shemitah Shemot Kol Baal Mashe Yado. Why do you have to use it twice? To tell me two types of Shemitah. Shemitah of land and Shemitah of money. The halacha that you cannot work your land and the halacha that you can't collect you can't collect money that's owed to you. That the two are linked and one only applies when the other applies. You can only have the Isser of not collecting money, the Isser to collect money, when the Isser of planting and working the ground during Shemitah applies. So you see, he says Abaye, there is a limitation to the mitzvah d'oraisa of Shemitah of the ground, of the land. What's the limitation? The limitation is when there is no Beis HaMikdash. Now, we don't need to define when it is, but the point is there is some time when there is no Isser of Shemitah d'oraisa, and that's the time which we're referring to here, when there's only Shemitah d'Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan allowed preventing loss. They allowed preventing long-term loss, and therefore they allowed watering. Okay, says Rava, I can tell you that it's even in all times. It's even in the time where there's Shemitah d'oraisa. And the reason that watering is allowed is because watering is not the av malacha of zareya, of planting, or of choresh, or of plowing. It's a tolda. It's a tolada of the two. And a tolada is only aser on Shabbos. A tolada is not aser on Shemitah. And you can tell that because the Torah lists some tolados and not others. It says, Ubashana Shviyah, Shabbos Shabbos Niyalar, Tzad Chalos Tizra. 7th year is a Shabbos for the ground. You shouldn't plant your field. Char Chalos Tizmor, and you should not prune your vine. You shouldn't harvest your vegetables that grow. You shouldn't harvest your grapes. Says the Gemara, hold on a second. Pruning is a tolada of planting, and picking grapes is a tolada of harvesting anything. Why do you have to mention those two separately? Obviously, most tolados are not forbidden during Shemitah. Only these ones that we mention are forbidden during Shemitah. Therefore, watering, which is a tolada of Zaraya, is not usher during Shemitah, and that's why you're allowed to do it during Shemitah, provided the conditions that the Mishnah lists.